Hello, greetings, and welcome. I'm Brien Posey, and in this video, I want to show you a technique that I've been working on recently inside of PowerShell. Now, I'm guessing that most of you are probably familiar with the concept of a progress bar. A progress bar is really nothing more than just a visual indicator that shows you how far into a particular task the system is, so that way you can estimate how much longer the task is likely to take to complete. We've all seen progress bars. They come in a million different forms, and you can very easily create a progress bar in PowerShell. Now, in the world of PowerShell, progress bars are often tied to loops. The idea being that a loop has to execute a certain number of times, and you can create a progress bar that shows how many times the loop has executed so that you can estimate how much longer the loop is likely to take in order to complete the task at hand. So that's how progress bars are often used in PowerShell. But recently I was faced with a bit of a dilemma. I needed to create a script that could track the progress of something that was happening outside of PowerShell. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if it could be done, but as it turns out it can, and it's really not even overly difficult to do. So that's what I want to show you in this video. So what kind of external task are we talking about? Well, one of the things that I do in my own environment is I create something called air-gapped backups. An air-gapped backup is just a backup that's written to removable media and then unplugged from the system. Now, that's not what I use for my primary backups. My primary backups are based on a continuous data protection system. I create air-gapped backups as a secondary backup. And the reason why I do that is very simple. Ransomware can't encrypt a backup that's not physically connected to the system. So the idea being that if I were to get a ransomware infection and it were to compromise my primary backups, well, I've still got those air-gapped backups that I could fall back on as a second line of defense and hopefully get my data back. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can create air-gapped backups, but I've experimented with a few different techniques, and in my own environment, the technique that I've really been using a lot because it seems to work well involves using a tool called Robocopy. Now, if you're not familiar with Robocopy, it's actually a part of Windows, but it's not a native PowerShell command. It's actually a command that's designed to be executed from the Windows command prompt. And Robocopy does a great job of copying files. It gives you a tremendous number of options. So even though I could use PowerShell native commands to copy files as I'm creating my air-gapped backups, I find that Robocopy is just more efficient and more flexible, and it's just easier to get the job done. But the question is, if Robocopy is its own process, how do you track its progress using a PowerShell progress bar? Well, that's a really interesting question to try to solve. So let me show you how I solve the problem. Here's the script that I came up with. Now, I'll tell you straight up that this script is not perfect. I designed this script more to be a proof of concept rather than to be a bulletproof backup utility. Here, I'm just doing a very simple file copy as a proof of concept because I wanted to demonstrate this technique to you. So it's the technique itself that's the really important part, not so much that this script will work in every situation, because I know it won't. For example, if there are files that already exist in the backup location, then the script isn't going to work correctly. And there are a few other things like that that can cause the script to malfunction. Even so, the main thing that I wanted to show you isn't how to use Robocopy, but rather how to tie Robocopy or any other external process for that matter to a progress bar. So let's take a look at how this works. So the very first thing that I'm doing inside of this script is to define my source and destination. Now, in this case, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be copying some files from w:/EVA104, and I'm going to be copying those files to w:/temp. So I'm simply copying files from one folder to another, and I'm doing that purely for the sake of demonstration. So the next thing that I'm doing is I'm setting up a variable called $number of files to copy, and I'm setting that equal to getChildItem, and then I'm setting the path to the source, which the source was w:/EVA104, and then I'm using recurse so that I'm checking all of these subfolders as well. And so from there, what I'm doing is I'm using measure object, and then I'm using select object, expand property, count. And what that's going to do is that's going to give me the total number of files in the source directory. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm setting up a variable called $number of files copied, and I'm doing that right here. And I'm initially setting that to 0. So then this line right here is where the script gets interesting. Technically, I could launch Robocopy from within PowerShell, and I could do that without having to have any additional code. But I need for Robocopy to run in an entirely separate process in order for what I'm doing to work. So what I'm doing is I'm using the start process commandlet, you can see right here, and the process that I'm starting isn't Robocopy, but rather PowerShell. So what I'm essentially doing is starting a new PowerShell session. Next, I've got my argument list, and the arguments that I'm using are no exit because I don't want that PowerShell session to close on me, and then -command, and then the command is Robocopy w:/EVA104 w:/temp, and then semicolon exit. And so what that's going to do is that's going to cause that session to close once my file copy process has completed. So when I run the script, what's going to happen is a brand new PowerShell window will open, Robocopy will launch automatically, it will copy all of the files in the source to the destination folder, and then once that file copy process has completed, Robocopy will close. Now the important takeaway here is that we're doing that in an entirely separate process from where our script is running. So how do we go about tracking the progress of that file copy process? Well, I did that with this bit of logic right here. So let's take a look at what I'm doing. So the first thing that I've got is a while loop. So I've got while number of files copied is LT, that's less than the number of files to copy, so my total number of files. Then what I'm going to do is execute this loop right here. And I'm going to do that for as long as the total number of files that need to be copied is less than the number of files that have actually been copied. So what am I doing within the loop? Well, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm defining a variable, number of files copied, and I'm setting that equal to getChildItem-path destination recurse file. And this is the exact same command that you saw earlier, except when I performed this command earlier, I was looking at the source path. So I was counting the number of files that need to be copied. Here, I'm looking at the destination. So what I'm doing is I'm counting the number of files that have already been copied. So then once I know the number of files that have been copied so far, I can update the progress bar. So I've created a variable called %complete, and I'm setting that equal to number of files copied divided by number of files to copy, and then multiplying that by 100 to get a percentage. So then the write progress commandlet is the commandlet that's used to create and update a progress bar. So I'm setting %complete equal to the $%complete variable that I created. The status is going to be set to copying files, and then the activity is going to be file number of files copied of number of files to copy, so that we can keep track of how many files have been copied and the total number of files that need to be copied. And then I've got a command start-sleep, and I'm setting that to 1 second. And the only reason why I'm using this command is just to slow the loop down a little bit. So the loop is going to work in near real time, but there's going to be a 1 second delay every time the loop progresses. And that's just to slow things down a little bit so that I can make sure that this works and we don't overwhelm the system. So then when the loop ends, we're updating the progress bar one last time, and we're setting it to completed, and the activity is copy process complete. So what does all this look like when it runs? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. And I'll run the script and press enter, and I'll press R for run. And when I do, you see that separate window fire up showing the Robocopy process. And here you can see my progress bar, and it's counting the number of files that are being copied. And so then when the copy process ends, that separate PowerShell session closes all by itself, and then my script completes. So that's how you can monitor the progress of an activity that's happening in an entirely separate process. I'm Brien Posey. Thanks for watching.